You are currently looking at the original design of New Barktown, featured in Pokemon's 1997 Space World demo. And today we're looking at 13 unused location designs in Gen 2 Pokemon. Now the design you see here did not last very long, as the game's development was quickly moved up to the Game Boy Color with enhanced graphics. And while this early build retains the same layout as the demo's design, we can see it also closely resembles the final version of New Barktown that we as players have come to know. The bottom right building is of a size to be Professor Elm's lab, the top house on the left looks like the player's house, and it even has the connecting water route heading east towards Kanto. The only thing massively changed here is the removal of a Poké Center. We can also go into the player's room and see how the Space World demo compares to the early design, and finally as it is in the more coherent layout we see in the final games. Now this is a subscription checkpoint for all you algorithm babies, but from here we'll head west to the very interesting Cherrygrove City. While there was no Space World demo for this location, the main section of the early build does greatly resemble the final version of Cherrygrove. Just like in the original, we have a Pokémon Center, mart, and 3 houses. At the bottom of the map, the ocean still leads to a hidden area we can assume would have been home to the guy that gives you Mystic Water. But what's very interesting to me, however, are the 2 most northern houses. The top of the map seems to lead up to what would be Route 30, and we can assume it would somehow loop back to the house on the left. Given its connection to Route 30 and it having a sign marker, we can also assume that this would have been the original location of Mr. Pokemon's house. As for the house on the right, only accessible through cuts, this is a little more uncertain. My best guess is this may have been the house of the berry expert we see just north on Route 30, but it's hard to know for sure. Either way, I think the final design is overall much better, with less backtracking and a more streamlined layout for a beginner player. Make sure to keep watching though, because we'll soon get to a town that was the original inspiration for Cherrygrove. But diving into Cherrygrove's Pokémon Center, we could see how things were slowly shrunk down, from the demo to the early design and onto the final. I think this refinement was indicative of the team needing to shrink most maps to make space on the cartridge. But speaking of cohesion, Violet City's original design saw the Poké Center, mart, and gym all right next to each other. In this design, Sprout Tower seems to be the town's centerpiece and oddly has a much more appealing architectural style than the one we were given. There's also an additional house here that we don't see make it to the final build. One of the labeled wooden roof buildings is clearly the school, another could be the Onyx Trade, and the last would be the other NPC house. But it's just really hard to say what the additional building would have been for, and I'm curious to hear your guys' speculation on this. One other really fun detail though is you can see how the 2 secret areas in this town came to be. In the final build, the northern section of the map has 2 sort of hidden areas, with the east having a rare candy and the west one having a PP up. I always found these areas to be a bit random, but a look at the early build suggests that they were inserted to just replace the top houses. And you'll notice this happening a lot more as we get further into the video. Now, before we get to Azaela Town, we're actually going to look at an unnamed town that was completely removed from the game. Map 2A680D seems to have been a twin city mirroring Azaela Town in the southern part of Johto. And with a bit of sleuthing, we can very quickly piece together where this removed location would have been. Route 32 sees the ocean running down the eastern side of the continent, and we can see the unnamed town would have very clearly been attached to the bottom of this route. I think this especially makes sense because the only Pokémon Center to not be located in a town is located at the bottom of Route 32. Realistically, the town was down here, and after they removed it, they just decided to leave this Pokémon Center in because the code was already there. If we move on to Azaela Town, we can see not only does it bear a huge resemblance to Cherrygrove, but it's actually missing a gym. It seems that somewhere along the development cycle, the unnamed town must have been merged into the small version of Azaela to make one larger town. Furthermore, if you look at the final version of Cherrygrove, you can see in the top right corner, there is a small piece of water surrounded by trees inaccessible to the player. And that piece of water very closely resembles the bottom left section of the unnamed town. And it shows that they would have actually been very close to each other. Now, Goldenrod City was also featured in the Space World demo and is one that has changed a lot over time. The radio tower has seen massive changes from its Space World build to the window-full version we know today. The Space World demo was also lacking the size which the 2 later versions seemed to get down. But even missing in the early version is the department store, underground path, Happiness Raider's house, and either Bill's house or the bike shop. To me though, the most fascinating aspect of both the demo and early build of Goldenrod is its connection to the ocean. If you look at a canonical map of Johto, you can see how Goldenrod sits directly across from the World Islands and Cyanwood City. Even in the final final build, this is accounted for with the inclusion of ocean just along the city and southern route. So it's quite apparent to me that there was originally intent to have the western side of Goldenrod connect to the ocean and be a shortcut to Olivine and Cyanwood. Now, while all the cities have seen change, none has seen a more necessary improvement than Ecruteak. While the Space World demo feels ironically quite solid, there are few early build towns that look as incohesive and poorly designed as the early Game Boy Color Ecruteak. The center of the city feels completely bare, while the access point to the gym and Tin Tower are awkwardly pushed to the top of the map, blocked off by a tree. There's even a magnet train station here, and that just doesn't make any sense given Ecruteak's proximity to Goldenrod. But relatively unchanged, however, is Olivine City. Despite shrinking from 19 down to a mere 9 houses, the general layout and feel to these two cities feel quite similar. I think this is another prime example of the game devs having to shrink the locations in order to fit everything on the cartridge, and it kind of results in Olivine not feeling like much of a city at all. Looking at the bottom part of the map, it's also sad to think about a reality where you could have traveled down the eastern shore to make it to Goldenrod City. Since Cyanwood didn't exist in the original build, it's also safe to assume that this is where such a route would have gone to. And so without an early Cyanwood, our next stop is Mahogany Town, which is probably the most unchanged location of early Johto. There was originally a basic mart here, but if we want something truly interesting, we'll have to turn our sights north to the City of Rage. What you're looking at right now is the original design of the Lake of Rage. The Lake Biwa area was originally intended to not only be a town, but also one that even hosted a gym. This not only explains why it's the only non-town location you can fly to, but also the entire maze that sits in the northwest side of the lake. I personally always felt it to be a very weird area, but looking at the map side by side, we can see how they just opted to fill it in with a maze of hidden items rather than completely redesigning the map. And since Cyanwood was a late addition, we can assume that this would have been the original home of Chuck, the fighting gym leader. But Blackthorn City is another town which has seen a lot of change. Originally, this area was much more forested than mountainous as we see in the original build. And while this must have originally been home of the Dragon's Den, I think the change to make it a separate location added a lot more significance to the area. The random filler maze in this early build just feels lazy and tedious. Most interestingly, however, is we can note the western path featured in the early build seems to have been replaced with the northeastern exit of the Ice Cave. This seems to suggest that the early version of Johto saw Route 44 as a connector between Mahogany and Blackthorn, rather than the player needing to traverse the non-existent ice path. The ice path was probably only added in when the team realized they needed a spot to feature the new ice Pokemon before the Dragon Gym. While there are a few early concepts that would have been nice to see in the polished version, I think we can agree the final version of Johto is a significant improvement over the original design. Thanks so much for watching, and please subscribe for part 2.